The wind that December evening spoke in the language of ghosts. It rattled the thin walls of Sarah Mae's cabin and whistled through the gaps where the wood had split from too many hard winters. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and stirred the pot of beans that would have to feed 4 people again tonight. The fire in the hearth was small, careful. Wood was precious when you had to gather it yourself from the frozen creek bed. Her 3 children sat at the rough table their father had built with his own hands before the fever took him 2 years past. Emma, the oldest at 12, mended a tear in her younger brother's shirt with thread so thin it barely held. Little Ben, only 7, carved patterns in the wood with a piece of charcoal, his stomach making sounds that matched the wind outside. Baby Ruth, though she wasn't really a baby anymore at 4, sat quiet as a mouse, braiding corn husks into dolls that cost nothing but time. Sarah Mae watched them in the lamplight and felt the familiar ache behind her ribs. They were good children, patient children. They never complained when the beans ran thin or when the milk cow went dry. They never asked for the things other children had. But she saw the way Emma's dresses hung loose now, how Ben's cheeks had lost their roundness, how Ruth fell asleep at the table more nights than not. The sound came sudden and sharp against the door. 3 knocks, weak but desperate. Sarah Mae's hand froze on the wooden spoon. Nobody traveled these roads after dark in December. Nobody with good intentions, anyway. She looked at her children, saw Emma's eyes go wide with the same fear that lived in Sarah Mae's chest these days. Fear of strangers. Fear of men with hard faces and empty hearts. Fear of losing what little they had left. The knocking came again, softer this time, like whoever was out there was using the last of their strength. Sarah Mae set down the spoon and walked to the window. She pulled back the cloth that served as a curtain and peered into the darkness. The snow was falling thick now, covering the world in a blanket of white silence. At first she saw nothing. Then a shadow moved near the door, and she caught sight of a man slumped against the frame of her porch. He was tall, even bent over as he was. His coat looked expensive, the kind of thing a cattle baron or railroad man might wear. But it was torn now, dark with what might have been blood. His hat had fallen into the snow, and his hair caught the light from her window like spun gold. Behind him, barely visible in the storm, stood a horse. Even in the dim light, Sarah Mae could see it was a fine animal. The kind worth more money than she'd see in 5 years of scraping by. The kind of horse that meant its rider had wealth beyond her understanding. But the man was dying. She could tell by the way he leaned against her door, by the shallow rise and fall of his chest, by the way his hand pressed against his side where the dark stains spread across his coat. "Mama!" Emma's voice was small behind her. Sarah Mae let the curtain fall and turned to look at her children. 3 pairs of eyes watched her, waiting to see what she would do. They trusted her to keep them safe. They trusted her to make the right choice. She thought of her husband, James, how he used to say that kindness was the only thing that cost nothing and was worth everything. She thought of the empty bean pot, of the last of their flour, of the cold that would creep in every time she opened that door. Then she thought of the man outside, bleeding in the snow. Sarah Mae unlatched the door. The wind rushed in like a wild thing, bringing snow and cold that made the children gasp. The stranger looked up at her with eyes blue as summer sky, but clouded with pain. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought. Maybe 30, maybe less. His face was pale, except for the fever flush on his cheeks. "Please," he whispered, and his voice was educated, gentle. "I don't want to die in the snow." Sarah Mae looked at his fine clothes, at the gold watch chain visible beneath his torn coat, at the leather boots that probably cost more than her cabin was worth. Every practical thought in her head told her to close the door. Rich men brought trouble. They brought questions and complications and dangers that poor widows couldn't afford. But his eyes held the same look she'd seen in James's face during those last fevered nights. The look of a soul that knew it was slipping away. "Emma," she said, not taking her gaze from the stranger's face. "Clear your father's bed. Ben, bank the fire and put more wood on. Ruth, bring me the clean cloth from the chest." The children moved without question, though she heard Emma's sharp intake of breath. The clean cloth was all they had left. The good cloth, saved for emergencies and special occasions that never seemed to come. Sarah Mae put her arm around the stranger's waist and felt him lean into her. He was heavier than James had been, solid with muscle under the expensive fabric. But he was burning with fever, and she could feel him shaking with more than cold. "What's your name?" she asked as they moved slowly toward the bed. "Thomas," he said, his voice barely more than breath. Thomas Whitmore. The name meant nothing to her, but she nodded anyway. Names didn't matter when someone was dying. Only the dying mattered. She helped him onto the bed that still smelled faintly of her husband's pipe tobacco. Thomas Whitmore's eyes fluttered closed as soon as his head touched the pillow, but his breathing was quick and shallow. Sarah Mae pulled back his coat and saw the wound in his side, deep and angry red. A knife wound, or maybe a bullet. The kind of wound that came from violence and bad choices. Emma appeared at her elbow with the cloth, and Sarah Mae took it without hesitation. It was the last good fabric in the house, white as fresh snow and soft as a prayer. She pressed it to the stranger's wound and watched it bloom red with his blood. "Is he going to die, Mama?" Ruth whispered from the foot of the bed. Sarah Mae looked at the man who'd stumbled into their lives like a fallen star. His breathing was steadier now, but she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. The fever would be the real fight. "I don't know, baby girl," she said, "but we're going to try to help him live." She sent Ben to fetch water from the well and Emma to find more clean rags, even though they both knew there weren't any. She spooned broth from their meager supper between Thomas Whitmore's lips and watched him swallow without waking. She bathed his fevered face with cool water and listened to him mumble words she couldn't understand. The children watched from the shadows, their own hunger forgotten in the presence of something bigger than their small lives. They saw their mother give the stranger their father's bed, their last good cloth, their only decent food. They saw her sit beside him through the long night, checking his breathing, cooling his fever, keeping death at bay with nothing but stubborn will and careful hands. As the hours passed and the snow continued to fall outside their windows, Sarah Mae found herself wondering about the man in her husband's bed. What kind of life had led him to their door? What kind of trouble had put that wound in his side? And what would happen to her children if helping him brought that trouble down on their heads? But each time doubt crept into her thoughts, she looked at his face in the lamplight and saw something that reminded her of James. Not in the features, but in the sadness that lingered even in sleep. The look of a man who'd lost more than he could bear to lose. The fire burned low, and Sarah Mae added the last of their good wood to the flames. Tomorrow she'd have to venture out in the cold to gather more, if the snow let up enough. Tomorrow she'd have to figure out how to stretch their food even thinner. Tomorrow she'd have to face whatever consequences this night would bring. But for now, in the quiet hours before dawn, she simply sat beside a dying stranger and wondered if kindness truly was worth everything, or if it might just cost them more than they could afford to pay. The first day, Thomas Whitmore burned like a forge in summer. Sarah Mae sat beside him with a bowl of well water and a rag that had once been part of her wedding dress. She bathed his face and neck, watching the fever flush come and go like waves on a distant shore. His lips moved constantly, shaping words she couldn't understand, speaking to people who weren't there. Emma helped without being asked, bringing fresh water when the bowl grew warm, holding the lamp steady when her mother needed both hands to tend the wound. Ben gathered what little firewood he could find under the snow, his thin arms carrying loads that would have been easy work a year ago, when he still had meat on his bones. Ruth sat in the corner with her corn husk dolls, whispering stories to them in a voice so soft it barely stirred the air. Sarah Mae watched her children and felt something tear inside her chest. Emma's dress hung on her like a grain sack. Ben's wrists stuck out from his sleeves like winter branches. Ruth's cheeks had lost the roundness that all children should have, the fullness that spoke of enough food and easy sleep. But she kept spooning broth between Thomas's fevered lips. She kept changing the bandage on his side, with strips torn from her own petticoat. She kept telling herself that this was what James would have done, what any decent person would do when faced with another soul's suffering. The second day brought no change. Thomas tossed and turned his body fighting battles Sarah Mae couldn't see. She gave him the last of their milk, mixed with water to make it stretch. She fed him bean soup thin to almost nothing, watching his throat work as he swallowed without waking. Emma found her crying that afternoon, standing at the empty cupboard with her hands pressed flat against the bare wood. "Mama," Emma's voice was careful, the way it got when she was trying to be older than 12. Sarah Mae wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "We'll manage, baby girl. We always do." But Emma was old enough now to see through gentle lies. She looked at the stranger in their father's bed, at the fine fabric of his torn coat, at the gold watch chain that caught the lamplight. Then she looked at her mother's thin face, at Ben picking at a bowl of watery beans, at Ruth who'd fallen asleep at the table again. "Maybe he has money," Emma whispered. "Maybe when he gets better, he'll pay us back." Sarah Mae pulled her daughter close, breathing in the scent of her hair. It smelled like wood smoke and worry, like childhood ending too soon. "We don't help people for money, Emma. We help them because it's right." Emma nodded, but Sarah Mae saw the question in her eyes. The same question that kept her awake at night, staring at the ceiling and listening to Thomas mutter in his fever dreams. What if right wasn't enough? What if kindness killed them all? On the third day, the fever broke. Sarah Mae was dozing in the chair beside the bed when she felt eyes watching her. She opened her own to find Thomas looking at her with clear blue eyes, no longer clouded with sickness. He was pale as fresh snow, but the terrible heat had left his skin. His breathing was deep and steady. "You're awake," she said, and her voice came out rusty from exhaustion. Thomas tried to sit up and winced, his hand going to the bandage at his side. Sarah Mae helped him settle back against the pillow, her touch gentle but firm. "Don't try to move yet. You've been sick 3 days." He looked around the cabin with eyes that saw everything. The patched curtains, the empty shelves, the 3 children who watched him from across the room with faces that showed their hunger as clearly as if they'd spoken it aloud. "My God," he whispered, "what have you done?" Sarah Mae followed his gaze and saw her home through his eyes. The poverty that had crept up on them so slowly she'd almost stopped noticing it. The way Emma's shoulder blades showed sharp through her dress. The way Ben's pants were held up with rope instead of a proper belt. The way Ruth's shoes had holes that led in the cold. "We helped you," Sarah Mae said simply. Thomas closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them again, they were bright with something that might have been tears. "You don't understand. I am Thomas Whitmore. I own half the cattle in 3 counties. I have more money than I know what to do with, and you." He gestured weakly at the sparse room. "You gave me everything you had." Sarah Mae stood and smoothed her skirt, a gesture that gave her time to think. The name meant nothing to her, but she could see the truth of his wealth in his clothes, in the fine leather of his boots, in the way he spoke like a man used to being heard. "Money doesn't stop a person from bleeding," she said. "It doesn't keep them warm when they're dying in the snow." Thomas watched her move to the stove, where she stirred the pot that held their evening meal. Beans again, stretched with water and hope. He saw her portion it carefully into 4 bowls, making sure each child got the same small amount. He saw her give herself the least, the way mothers do when there isn't enough to go around. "Tell me your name," he said when she brought him a bowl. "Sarah Mae Thompson." She helped him sit up enough to eat, ignoring his sharp intake of breath. "These are my children, Emma, Ben, and Ruth." The children nodded solemnly and used to strangers who knew their names. Thomas looked at each face, memorizing them in a way that made Sarah Mae wonder what he was thinking. That night, as the fever dreams faded, Thomas began to talk. Not the fevered muttering of the past 3 days, but real words spoken to the woman who sat beside his bed in the lamplight. He told her about cattle drives that stretched for miles, about land that rolled green and endless under big sky. He spoke of railroad deals and bank loans, of money that flowed like water and power that corrupted like poison. His voice carried the weight of regret, of choices made for profit instead of people. "I haven't been home in 2 years," he said, staring at the ceiling. "My own house feels empty as a tomb. Servants who call me sir and mean nothing by it. Meals eaten alone at a table that seats 20. Sarah Mae listened without judgment, The way she'd learned to listen to James when the war memories got too heavy for him to carry alone. Sometimes listening was the only gift you could give a person whose heart was breaking. I had a brother once, Thomas continued, his voice growing softer. Charlie, he said I was forgetting what mattered. Said money was making me hard inside, like winter ground that won't take seed. He turned his head to look at her. He was right. What happened to him? Pneumonia. 3 winters back. I was in Chicago, making some deal I thought was important. Got the telegram 2 days after the funeral. Thomas's hands clenched into fists on top of the quilt. All that money, and I couldn't buy myself enough time to say goodbye to the only person who still saw good in me. Sarah Mae reached out without thinking and covered his fist with her hand. His skin was still warm from the fever, but no longer burning. Just human warmth, the kind that reminded her he was alive when he so easily might not have been. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind outside and the soft breathing of the children. The lamplight flickered against the walls, casting shadows that danced and settled like memories finding their place. Why did you help me? Thomas asked finally. You didn't know who I was. For all you knew, I could have been an outlaw, a killer. Sarah Mae thought about her answer for a long time. She looked at her children, sleeping peacefully despite their empty bellies. She thought about James and the kind of man he'd been, the kind of father who'd wanted his children to grow up knowing the difference between right and wrong. Because you were dying, she said at last, and because my children were watching to see what I would do. Thomas followed her gaze to where Emma lay curled beside Ben and Ruth on their shared mattress. The 3 of them keeping each other warm under quilts that had been patched and repatched until they were more patches than original fabric. They're beautiful children, he said quietly. They're good children. Better than they have any right to be, considering. Considering what? Sarah Mae stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow that still fell in the darkness. Their father died 2 years ago. Fever took him, same as almost took you. We've been managing since then, but managing gets harder every winter. She didn't tell him about the letters from the bank, the ones that talked about overdue payments and foreclosure. She didn't mention the way she counted every bean, every grain of flour, making sums in her head that never added up to enough. Some burdens were too heavy to share, even with a stranger who'd seen their poverty with his own eyes. Thomas was quiet for so long that Sarah Mae thought he'd fallen asleep again. But when she turned from the window, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Something had changed in his face during their conversation. Some wall had come down or some decision had been made. Sarah Mae, he said, and her name sounded different in his voice now. Gentler, more careful. I need to tell you something about why I was riding alone that night, why someone put a knife in my side. But Sarah Mae shook her head and moved back to his bedside. You need a rest now. Stories can wait until you're stronger. She tucked the quilt around him the way she tucked in her own children, with hands that had learned gentleness from years of practice. Thomas caught her wrist as she pulled away, his grip weak but determined. Promise me something, he said. Promise me you'll let me make this right. Sarah Mae looked down at his hand on her wrist, at the gold ring on his finger that probably cost more than her cabin. She saw the earnestness in his eyes, the way he was looking at her like she'd given him something precious instead of just doing what any decent person would do. There's nothing to make right, she said softly. You don't owe us anything. But even as she said the words, Sarah Mae wondered if she was wrong. Not about the debt. Kindness didn't create debts. It created something else entirely. Something that might be more dangerous than owing money, because it reached deeper than pockets and touched the places where hearts learned to trust again. By the 5th day, Thomas was strong enough to sit by the fire. Sarah Mae helped him from the bed to the old wooden chair that had been James's favorite, watching his face go pale with the effort. His wound was healing clean, but slowly. The knife had gone deep, missing vital parts by inches that felt like the width of God's mercy. Emma wrapped him in one of their father's quilts, the blue one with yellow stars that Sarah Mae had stitched during her first pregnancy, when hope still came easy. Thomas pulled it close around his shoulders and stared into the flames, his eyes holding shadows that went deeper than physical pain. "Thank you," he said to Emma, and his voice carried the kind of gentleness that made Sarah Mae think of her husband. The way James used to speak to the children, like their words mattered as much as any grown person's. Emma smiled, the first real smile Sarah Mae had seen from her daughter in weeks. "Mama says you're getting better. Your mama's right. She's a fine healer." Sarah Mae felt warmth rise in her cheeks at the praise. She busied herself at the stove, stirring a pot that held more water than substance. The last of their winter stores was nearly gone, stretched thin as morning mist over the long days of caring for Thomas. She watched him from the corner of her eye as he talked quietly with the children. Ben showed him the carved animals he'd whittled from scraps of firewood: a horse, a cow, a bird that might have been a hawk or might have been a prayer with wings. Ruth brought her corn husk dolls and whispered their names, pointing out which one was the mama, which ones are the babies. Thomas listened to each word like it was gospel truth. He held Ben's carvings with careful hands, turning them in the firelight and pointing out details that made the boy's thin chest puff with pride. He learned the names of Ruth's dolls and asked about their families, their stories, their dreams. Sarah Mae had seen wealthy men before, riding through town in their fine carriages with faces closed tight as locked doors. They looked through poor folks like they were made of air. But Thomas looked at her children like they were treasures, like their small lives held value beyond measure. That evening, as Sarah Mae served their meager supper, she saw Thomas watching the careful way she divided the food. 4 bowls, each with exactly the same small portion. She saw him notice how Emma eyed the last piece of bread on the table, how Ben's stomach growled loud enough to hear, how Ruth fell asleep in her chair before finishing her beans. And she saw him notice how she ate the least of all, taking tiny bites and pushing the rest around her bowl to make it look like more. "Sarah Mae," he said quietly, after the children had gone to bed. She was washing the bowls in a basin of water she'd heated over the fire, making them last another day. Her hands moved slowly, making the work stretch so she wouldn't have to sit idle and think about tomorrow's empty cupboards. "You don't eat enough." Sarah Mae dried her hands on her apron and didn't turn around. "I eat plenty. I've been watching. You give your children your food. I give my children what they need." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. She heard him shift in the chair, heard the rustle of the quilt. When he spoke again, his voice was soft as falling snow. "You're starving yourself to keep them alive." Sarah Mae finally turned to face him. In the firelight, his features looked sharper than they had in the fever, but also sadder, like a man who'd seen too much of the world's hardness and was just now remembering what softness looked like. "They're children," she said simply. "It's what mothers do." Thomas reached into his coat, the fine wool garment that hung on a peg by the door. Sarah Mae heard the soft clink of metal, saw him pull out a small leather pouch that bulged with weight. He held it out to her across the space between them. "Take this." Sarah Mae looked at the pouch, but didn't move to accept it. She could see gold coins through the leather, more money than she'd ever held in her hands at one time. Enough to buy food for months, clothes for the children, wood for the fire. Enough to push back the wolf that had been scratching at their door all winter. "I can't take your money. It's not payment." Thomas's voice was urgent now, pressing. "It's gratitude. You saved my life. I did what anyone would do." "No." Thomas shook his head, and the firelight caught the gold in his hair. "No, you did what almost no one would do. You took in a stranger when you had nothing to spare. You fed me when your own children were hungry. You gave me your husband's bed, your last clean cloth, your only decent food." Sarah Mae crossed her arms over her chest, a gesture that felt like closing a door. "And you think that means I did it for money? I think it means you deserve to be rewarded for your goodness. Kindness isn't something you pay for, Mr. Whitmore. It's something you do because it's right." Thomas stared at her for a long moment, the leather pouch still extended between them like a bridge she wouldn't cross. Slowly, he lowered his hand, but his eyes never left her face. "You shame me," he said quietly. "I don't mean to. I know you don't. That's what makes it worse." Thomas leaned forward in the chair, his hand pressed to his healing wound. "Do you know what my life looks like, Sarah Mae? I have a house with 30 rooms. 30 rooms, and I use maybe 3 of them. I have servants who bow and scrape and tell me how wonderful I am, but they wouldn't piss on me if I was on fire unless I paid them first. Sarah Mae flinched at his crude language, but she heard the pain underneath it. The loneliness that money couldn't cure. I eat meals that cost more than most people make in a month, and I eat them alone at a table that could seat my whole board of directors. I sleep in a bed that belonged to some dead railroad baron, under sheets that cost more than your cabin is worth. And I wake up every morning feeling like I'm drowning in gold. Thomas's voice broke on the last words, and Sarah Mae saw tears catch the firelight in his eyes. When I was a boy, he continued, my mother used to make molasses cookies every Sunday after church. The whole house would smell like cinnamon and love. She'd give us each 2 cookies, no more, no less, and we'd eat them slow to make them last. I haven't tasted anything that good in 20 years, even though I can afford to buy every bakery from here to San Francisco. Sarah Mae sat down in the chair across from him, drawn by the raw honesty in his voice. She'd seen grief before, in her own mirror after James died. But this was different. This was a man mourning his own lost soul. What happened to you? She asked gently. Thomas smiled, but it was a smile full of thorns. I got everything I thought I wanted. Every acre of land, every head of cattle, every dollar I could squeeze out of this hard world. And somewhere along the way, I forgot that the best things in life can't be bought. He gestured around the sparse cabin, taking in the patched walls, the worn furniture, the simple peace that filled the small space. This place, he said, these 3 days with you and your children, it's the first time I've felt at home in years. The first time I felt like I was worth something that wasn't measured in dollars and cents. Sarah Mae felt her heart crack open a little, the way it had when she'd found James's reading glasses still folded on his bedside table weeks after the funeral. Some kinds of loss went so deep they changed the shape of your soul. You could go back, she said softly. You could change things. Thomas shook his head. I've got enemies now. Men who want what I have, who'd kill me for it. That knife in my side wasn't random, Sarah Mae. Someone's been hunting me for months. Fear touched Sarah Mae's heart like cold fingers. Are we in danger? My children? No. Thomas's voice was firm, certain. I'll be gone before anyone connects me to this place. I won't bring my troubles down on your family. But even as he said it, Sarah Mae saw something in his eyes that made her wonder if leaving would be harder than he expected. He looked around the cabin like a man, memorizing a place he might never see again, taking in details he wanted to carry with him. I used to have a brother, Thomas said suddenly. Charlie. He died 3 years ago, and I wasn't there. I was making some damn deal that seemed important at the time, making money while he was dying alone. Sarah Mae reached across the space between them and covered his hand with hers. His skin was warm now, no longer fevered, but she could feel him trembling. Charlie used to say I was losing myself in all that gold. Said it was making me hard inside, turning my heart to stone. I laughed at him, called him a fool for not understanding business. Thomas's voice dropped to a whisper, but he was right. I became someone I don't even recognize. Someone who could have everything and still have nothing at all. They sat in silence for a while, watching the fire burn low. Outside, the wind had stopped, and the world felt hushed under its blanket of snow. Sarah Mae thought about her own losses, about the way grief could hollow you out or fill you up, depending on how you carried it. You're not that man anymore, she said finally. Thomas looked at her with something like hope flickering in his eyes. How can you be sure? Because that man wouldn't have cared about my children's names. He wouldn't have listened to Ben's stories about his wooden animals. He wouldn't have asked Ruth about her dolls. Sarah Mae squeezed his hand gently, and he sure wouldn't have cried over molasses cookies and Sunday afternoons. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the dying flames. When he spoke again, his voice was different, steadier, like a man who'd found something he'd thought was lost forever. I don't know how to go back to that life, he said. I don't know how to be the man I was before all the money, all the hardness. Sarah Mae stood and moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered world. The storm had passed, leaving everything clean and white and new. Tomorrow would bring challenges. Empty cupboards, cold winds, the endless struggle to keep her family safe and fed. But tonight, in this moment, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Maybe you don't go back, she said softly. Maybe you go forward instead. Become someone new. Thomas rose from his chair, moving slowly but steadily. His strength was returning day by day. Soon he'd be well enough to travel, to face whatever dangers waited for him out there in the world beyond her door. But Sarah Mae could see in his eyes that when he left this place, he wouldn't be leaving unchanged. Something had taken root in him during these quiet days by her fire, something that might grow into the man his brother Charlie had always believed he could be. On the 7th morning, Thomas stood at the window and watched the sun rise over the snow-covered prairie. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, and he saw a face he almost recognized. The same blue eyes, the same strong jaw, but something different in the set of his mouth. Something softer. Something that looked like the man his brother Charlie had always believed he could be. Behind him, Sarah Mae moved quietly around the cabin, starting the morning fire, measuring out the last handful of coffee beans they'd been saving. She worked with the careful grace of a woman who'd learned to make everything precious, every grain of sugar, every drop of milk, every moment of warmth. "You're feeling stronger," she said without turning around. Thomas touched the bandage at his side. The wound was healing clean, pulling tight with new skin. In another day or two, he'd be able to ride without tearing it open again. Strong enough to travel. Sarah Mae's hand stilled on the coffee pot. She didn't ask where he was going or when he planned to leave. She'd learned long ago that some questions brought answers you weren't ready to hear. Thomas watched her children wake up one by one. Ruth first, rubbing sleep from her eyes and climbing down from the bed she shared with her siblings. Then Ben, stretching thin arms above his head before padding to the window to see if the snow had melted. Finally Emma, who woke like her mother, instantly alert, already thinking about the day's tasks and responsibilities. They ate breakfast together one last time, sharing weak coffee and the last of the cornbread. Thomas watched Emma tear her piece into tiny bites to make it last longer. He saw Ben give half of his portion to Ruth when he thought no one was looking. He saw Sarah Mae push her food around her plate, eating barely enough to keep a bird alive. These children knew hunger, but they'd never learned selfishness. Their mother had taught them that sharing was more important than having, that kindness mattered more than comfort. Thomas thought about his own childhood, about Sunday dinners where his mother had loaded their plates with more food than they could eat, and how he'd taken it all for granted. After breakfast, while Sarah Mae tended to the morning chores and the children played quietly by the fire, Thomas sat at the small wooden table with paper and ink he'd asked Emma to fetch from town. His hands shook slightly as he wrote, not from weakness, but from the weight of what he was doing. The letter wasn't long. Simple words that would change everything. He wrote to Henry Morrison, president of the First Bank of Topeka, a man who owed Thomas favors going back years, who would do what was asked without questions. The letter instructed Morrison to transfer ownership of the River Valley property to one Sarah Mae Thompson of Kansas, payment for medical services rendered. The deed would be delivered within the month, along with enough cash to pay any taxes or fees. Thomas had bought the River Valley land 3 years ago as an investment, 2,000 acres of the richest soil he'd ever seen. Black earth that could grow anything you planted in it, watered by a creek that never ran dry. He planned to raise cattle there someday, when he got tired of buying other men's ranches. But as he signed his name to the letter, Thomas knew he'd never been happier to give anything away. He sealed the envelope with wax from Sarah Mae's candle and wrote Morrison's name across the front in careful script. Then he sat back and looked around the cabin that had become more of a home to him in 7 days than his mansion had ever been. Emma was teaching Ruth to read from her father's old Bible, pointing to each word with patient fingers. Ben was carving again, working on what looked like a horse this time, his tongue poking out in concentration. Sarah Mae hummed softly as she mended a tear in one of Ben's shirts, her needle moving in quick, sure stitches. Peace. That's what this was. Thomas had read about it in books, heard preachers talk about it from pulpits, but he'd never felt it in his bones until now. This quiet contentment that came from being exactly where you belonged, with people who cared about you for reasons that had nothing to do with money or power or what you could do for them. That evening, as the children settled down for sleep, Thomas pulled Emma aside. "I need you to take this to town tomorrow," he said, pressing the sealed letter into her hand along with a silver dollar. "Give it to the postmaster. Tell him it needs to go to Topeka as fast as possible." Emma looked at the coin in her palm like it was a fallen star. "This is too much for postage. Keep what's left. Buy something sweet for you and your brother and sister." Emma's eyes went wide. A whole silver dollar was more money than she'd held in her entire life. "Mama says we don't take charity." Thomas knelt down, so they were eye to eye. "This isn't charity, Emma. This is a friend asking a favor. Sometimes friends help each other, and that's not the same thing as charity at all." Emma thought about this for a moment, her young face serious. Then she nodded and tucked the letter and coins safely into her dress pocket. "Are you leaving tomorrow?" she asked quietly. Thomas felt his throat tighten. "Early, before sunrise. Will we see you again?" It was a question he'd been dreading, because he didn't know the answer. His enemies were still out there, still hunting him. Going back to his old life would mean putting himself in danger, but staying would mean putting this family in danger too. "I don't know, little one, but I'll never forget you, or your mother's kindness, or the way you made me feel like I was part of family again." Emma threw her arms around his neck, hugging him tight. "I won't forget you either, Mr. Thomas." Later, after the children were asleep, Thomas sat with Sarah Mae by the dying fire. They didn't talk much. Some things were too big for words, too deep for explanations. They just sat together in the lamplight, listening to the wind outside and the soft breathing of the children. "I wish things were different," Thomas said finally. Sarah Mae looked up from the sock she was darning. "Different how?" "I wish I could stay. I wish I could help you properly, the way you helped me. I wish I could watch your children grow up and become the fine people I know they'll be." Sarah Mae set down her needle and thread. "You did help us, Thomas. More than you know." "How?" "By eating your food and taking up space in your husband's bed." Sarah Mae smiled, and in the firelight she looked younger, the way she might have looked when James was alive and the world held more hope than worry. "You showed my children that strangers can be kind, that helping someone doesn't always bring trouble, that there are still good people in the world, even when everything seems dark." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "You reminded me of why James and I wanted to raise them to be generous, even when generosity is hard." Thomas felt tears sting his eyes. "You saved my life, Sarah Mae, not just from the wound, but from something worse. I was drowning in gold like I told you, forgetting what it meant to be human. You and your children pulled me back from that edge." They sat in comfortable silence until the fire burned down to embers. Then Sarah Mae rose and banked the coals for the night, preparing to go to bed. At the door to the small room where she slept alone, she turned back to him. "Whatever you do when you leave here, Thomas, remember what you learned. Remember that the best things in life can't be bought or sold. They can only be given freely from one heart to another." Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice to speak. Before dawn, while the family still slept, Thomas dressed quietly and gathered his few belongings. His coat had been mended with careful stitches, his wound had been tended with gentle hands, his soul had been restored with simple kindness. He left a note on the table, written in the same careful script he'd used for the letter to the bank. "Sarah Mae, you asked me what true wealth looks like. I found my answer in your kindness, your children's laughter, and the way you shared everything you had with a stranger who needed help. Thank you for showing me that a rich man isn't someone who has everything, but someone who gives everything he can. Your friend always, Thomas." He slipped out into the cold morning air, saddled his horse by starlight, and rode away without looking back. If he had looked back, he would have seen Sarah Mae standing at the window, watching him go with tears on her cheeks and a prayer on her lips. 3 weeks later, Henry Morrison arrived at Sarah Mae's door in a fine carriage, carrying papers that would change everything. He was a small, neat man with kind eyes and a voice that shook with emotion as he explained about the River Valley property, about the deed that made Sarah Mae one of the largest landowners in 3 counties. I've known Thomas Whitmore for 15 years, Morrison said as Sarah Mae stared at the legal documents with her name written in careful script. I've seen him buy and sell more land than most men even dream of owning. But I've never seen him give anything away without expecting something in return. Until now. Sarah Mae folded the papers carefully, her hands trembling. 2,000 acres of rich farmland. Enough to feed her children for the rest of their lives. Enough to send them to school, to give them choices she'd never dreamed possible. But as she tucked the deed away in her husband's old Bible, Sarah Mae knew the real gift wasn't the land. It was the lesson her children had learned about helping others, about the kind of people they wanted to become. It was the way Emma had carried herself a little taller since Thomas left, proud of her role in posting his letter. It was the way Ben had started carving gifts for his sisters instead of just for himself. It was the way Ruth had begun sharing her corn husk dolls with imaginary children who had none of their own. Spring came early that year, melting the snow and warming the earth until it was soft enough to plant. Sarah Mae stood in her new field, rich black soil between her fingers, and thought about seeds. Some grew quick and gave you food for the table. Others took years to mature, decades to show their true worth. She planted corn and beans and squash, practical things that would feed her family through the next winter. But she also planted apple trees and shade oaks, things that would take time to grow but would last for generations. Her children worked beside her, their hands dark with earth, their faces bright with possibility. As Sarah Mae pressed the last seed into the warm soil, she thought about Thomas Whitmore and wondered where his journey had taken him. She hoped he'd found his way back to the man his brother Charlie had believed in. She hoped he'd learned to use his wealth like a tool for good instead of a wall between himself and the world. But mostly, she hoped he understood that the true harvest of their time together wasn't measured in acres or gold coins, but in the way kindness had planted seeds in both their hearts that would keep growing long after the last snow had melted and the first green shoots had pushed their way toward the sun.